Hi everyone, this is an updated video to how I brew beer using electricity. A lot has changed since my last video. I no longer use extract. I've switched to all grain and I'm doing brew in a bag. So I'm just going to give you the high level steps that I use to do it today, at least for fall 2018. This is how I'm doing it. The setup's gotten quite more elaborate, probably too elaborate, but I don't know, maybe that's the mad scientist in me. So this is the first step. I use tap water now, coming off the street and then going through a charcoal filter, which then goes up into the kettle. I don't use soft water anymore from our fridge because it was extracting and removing minerals that are needed. That's good for beer. Soft water is great for showering and bathing, but not so good for beer. So the first thing I do is I run this filter and dump the first couple gallons out because of charcoal dust, and just let it slowly fill up. Once it gets past the heating element, I turn the heating element on to set the water's temperature for mashing. And for the freshest beer possible, I now mill my own grains using this grain mill and my cordless drill. And for this recipe, I'm going to mill 10.7 pounds of Pale 2-row. I'm going to run it through twice to really make sure I break open all the hulls and for maximum efficiency. I do this while the kettle's filling up with water. With the milling complete, you can see all the crushed grains. I've run it through twice, ready to add to the bag. Okay, so the water level is now above the heating element, so I'm going to grab the false bottom, add it to the kettle. Make sure it lays flat. And then connect the 220 volt power on, and over here is the controller. Go ahead and turn that guy up to 100% and start heating the water. And I'll keep filling the kettle till it gets about 7 or 8 gallons. You can hear the element already start to kick in. Okay, so we reached our target of 8¼ gallons of water. Now I'm heating up the temperatures to, I'm going for 159. The mash temperature we're using today is 154. The grain is at 70. So to make it 154, I need to bring the water up to 159. I use biabcalculator.com to calculate those values. Once the temperature hits 159, I can put the bag in and start adding the grains for the mash. For this particular batch, I'm going to increase some mineral content. As you can see from water testing I did 6 months ago, calcium is at 36 parts per million and sulfates at 27. You really want calcium to be somewhere between 50 and 150, and sulfates you should have between 50 and 250, and I'm at 27. Since I'm making a pale ale, I'm going to increase these values by adding calcium sulfate to increase the calcium and the sulfate. And what we're using here is calcium sulfate, also known as gypsum powder, and I'm going to be adding about 4.3 grams to the batch to boost up those values, and that should give a little bit more of a dry, crisp taste on the palate. Okay, so we've reached our strike temperature of 159 degrees, and we have added the bag. We've turned off the heat, out of the bag and attach them with these really high-tech clips. So the next step is to stir in the grains, and that'll be our mash. Since this requires 2 hands, I have to stop the video, so I'll be right back. Okay, we finished stirring in the mash, and we're gonna check the temperature here. Looking at about 150.8, it should be 154. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn the heat on, probably about 20-25%, and monitor this and keep it at 154 for an hour, checking it every few minutes and stirring it around, make sure there's no dough balls or any clumps in here, and just keeping it at 154 with the lid on for about an hour. Okay, the temp is at 153, 154, and I ran the pump for a little bit to kind of circulate the liquid and stabilize the temperature. So I put the lid on, set a timer for 60 minutes, and I've got the controller right around 35%, and I'll just keep an eye on it and just maintain that 153, 154 temperature range, stirring the mash every 10, 15, 20 minutes or so. Just keeping on it and adjusting it as needed for the 60-minute duration. With the 60-minute mash done, I raised the bag up using this hoist attached to this steel bar, which is mounted to the joists in the ceiling of the garage. Like I said, this is probably too elaborate, but whatever. While that's draining, I turn the power up to 100% to bring it to a boil. And then once it starts boiling, we can do our first hop addition. While I'm waiting for the kettle to come to a boil and the bag continues to drip, I use my brew spoon and gloves and remove the false bottom and rinse it off and set it aside to dry. We no longer need the false bottom at this point because the bag is out of the kettle. Another thing I do while I'm waiting for it to boil is I put on my long brewing gloves and I squeeze the crap out of the bag to release almost a half gallon more liquid. We were at just around 7 1/4, and now we're at about 7 3/4 gallons. So you can get a lot more sugars out of the grains if you squeeze the bag. It's going to be hot, so make sure you're wearing long gloves, and also make sure you are above the bag and not below it. Otherwise, you're going to have hot liquid run all the way down your arms and onto your shoulders and sides. Ask me how I know this. Then I set the bag down and let it just sit in the bucket for now. I'm just waiting for it to come to a boil. We're getting pretty close. All right, we're just at around 211, 212 degrees. We have a boil. But the beauty of electric brewing, as you can tell, or you can hear, or the lack of hearing, there's no sound. It's completely silent. And we've got ourselves a full boil. This is a 15-gallon kettle. I've learned that an 8-gallon or even 10-gallon kettle may not be enough for a 5-gallon batch because you're going to have boilovers. And here we go. We are now at the full boil stage. We're going to do our first hop addition for this Cascade Pale Ale, and that's what I'm going to add 1/4 ounces of Cascade pellets for bittering, and let that sit in there for a full 60 minutes, and we'll see you in an hour. Actually, I'll be back in less than 60 minutes because I have a few more additions. One thing that's important to note is do not put the lid on your pot. Not only will that cause boilovers, but dimethyl sulfide, or DMS, will build up, and that will add off flavors such as buttery popcorn. And nobody wants a buttery popcorn flavored beer. So make sure you remove the lid, and there will be a boil off rate. So you're going to lose probably 1 gallon or 1.25 gallons per hour. And you got to take all this into account. To end up with a 5-gallon batch, you're going to start with somewhere around 7.5 to 8.5 gallons of water, because you're going to have boil off and loss to other things like transfers to the fermenter, etc. So I will be back for the next edition. All right, with 15 minutes left of the 60-minute boil, we're about 6.5 gallons or so down to, and I'm running the pump to sanitize the hose and the fittings, and I've added a half teaspoon of yeast nutrient to the batch. And when the boil ends in 15 minutes, I will be switching on the whirlpool mode and letting it cool naturally. You'll see more on that in a minute. Okay, the timer just reached 0. We had a 60-minute boil. It is complete. We have about 6 gallons of wort as a result. I've cut the power to 0, and just to be on the safe side, tripped the circuit breaker and unplugged it. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put the lid on. And I've got the pump running, circulating the wort in a whirlpool fashion. And when it gets down to about 180 degrees, I'm going to add half of the 5.5 ounces of Cascade pellets I have left. And when it gets down to about 165 or so, I'm going to add the other half and just let it continue to whirlpool. And when it gets down to about 150 or so, I'll put in the immersion chiller. Whirlpool's been running for a few minutes and we're down to about 165 degrees, so I'm going to go ahead and add about half of these 5.5 ounces of Cascade pellets. Okay, so the temp's down to about 155. I'm going to go ahead and add the second half of the 5.5 ounces of hot pellets. This is about 2.25 ounces of Cascade. I do want to note that I turned the pump off, otherwise you're going to suck the hard pellets right into the pump. It's going to make a really horrible noise. So I usually just turn off the pump, add the hops in, and then stir them up for about a minute with a spoon before firing up the pump again and continuing the whirlpool. I've been letting it naturally cool down this whole time. It's been almost, 30, 45 minutes to get it down to 165 and then 155 after that. Once I get the pump running again, I'll add the immersion chiller and actually pump cold water through it to bring the wort down to a fermentable temperature in the 60s or 70 degrees. Okay, so to cool down the wort, I take my immersion chiller and I clean it and sanitize the crap out of it with Star San, place it in the kettle, and then I connect it to a fountain pump, and I have 4 giant blocks of ice, 2 I put in so far to keep the water ice cold. Pumps the cold water through the chiller, hot water comes out the other side into another bucket where I monitor the temperature. When it gets down to around 90 or so, I just have the hot water going back into the same bucket as the cold water, but for now I have it separated, that way it doesn't melt the ice so quickly. And I just keep this process going and keep adding water until I get the temperature down to about 70 degrees or so. While the wort is cooling down, I clean and sanitize my fermenter. I use the SS Brewtech brew bucket. I've modified it and put a hole in the middle of the lid and added a 12-inch long thermal well so the temperature probe can be inserted all the way down to the center of the beer as it ferments to get accurate temperature readings. So I've already cleaned it, and I got Star San in there right now. And I'm going to put that lid on, shake it a couple more times, make sure it's sanitized. Dump out the remaining sanitizer and get ready to transfer the beer into the fermenter. Actually, it's wort at this point, it's not even beer. And everything from this side on needs to be sanitized. Anything that the wort comes in contact with will need to be sanitized from here on out to reduce infections. All right, the temperature now is around 65 degrees inside the kettle, so I've turned off the pump and I'm going to just let everything just settle for about 10, 15, 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to transfer the wort into the sanitized fermenter. While I'm waiting for the hops and other particulates to settle inside the kettle, I've put a packet of yeast and, it's hard to see, but kitchen scissors in there to sanitize it. You don't want to have any bacteria on your scissors or on your yeast packet before you open it. Again, everything going forward needs to be sanitized. So everything is just sitting inside this tray of Star San, and then I seal it and give it a good shake. Get some foam going in there and just let it sit while the kettle settles down. And we'll get ready to rack the wort into the fermenter shortly. Okay, so I've added a sanitized hop basket to the edge of the fermenter and disconnected the line from the back of the kettle that was feeding the whirlpool. And so currently the wort is now draining out, going through the pump, and then into the hop basket just through gravity. It's not actually running, the pump is actually not running it now. So I'm going to just keep this running until I've drained the majority of the wort into the fermenter. Okay, the next thing I do is I oxygenate the wort by connecting an oxygen tank to an oxygenation wand, like you see here. And I just stir it around for about a minute or a minute and a half. With the setting at 1 LPM. And what this does is it infuses oxygen into the wort so the yeast can take off and consume that oxygen up front. Okay, after oxygenation is complete, we've got about 5.25 gallons or so. We're going to go ahead and add our yeast. Again, this has been sitting in sanitizer, so we'll have the scissors, cut the yeast open, sprinkle it on top. Again, I'm using Safel US-05. It's a very common dry yeast. Add that to the fermenter. I also have some liquid yeast I've harvested from a previous batch. I want to pitch that in as well. This is optional, but liquid yeast usually is going to kick off quicker than the dry yeast. And we seal it up. Alright, I installed a 2-piece airlock into the fermenter and put star sand in it. Sometimes I put vodka in it though, because star sand gets really foamy, but vodka also has a tendency to evaporate, but at least vodka doesn't get all bubbly. Anyway, the thermowell, I put about 10 milliliters of water in there, and then I insert the temperature probe from the controller. Here's a temperature controller. I've got it set to 66 degrees. Currently the liquid is measuring 72.6. All of this is installed in the fermenting chamber, also known as a refrigerator. This is a Rockstar / Monster energy drink cooler that you'd see at a Quickie Mart. What I do next is put a fan on top to circulate the air and let the yeast do its thing. Before I clean out the kettle, I put some into a glass, what's left over, and let it settle. Then I use the dropper with my refractometer and measure the original gravity. This particular recipe is calling for 1.051 and mine measured at 1.054. So pretty close. Okay, so it's the next night. I brewed the beer yesterday, Sunday afternoon. It's now Monday night. The ferm chamber is running right now and keeping the temperature at 66 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. And here we can see fermentation is happening for sure. I have a fan at an angle to circulate the air inside, and this is just a giant sock filled with silica cat litter, honestly, to keep down the condensation and moisture that builds on the inside when the fridge runs. So we just let this run for 7 days. The next Sunday we will transfer it to secondary on top of a bed of some more Cascade hops. Alright, so I had brewed Sunday morning and transferred it to the fermenter that afternoon. It is now Wednesday morning, and we can see there's still quite a bit of fermentation activity going on. So I want to continue to let this go until next Sunday when I transfer it to the secondary with some more hops. Okay, so 14 days have passed since brew day. About 7 days ago, I racked the beer from one fermenter to another and added 4 ounces of hop pellets for some dry hopping. and that re-kicked off the fermentation process. The airlock was pretty busy at that point. Yesterday I swapped out the airlock for this medical grade urine bag, and what this does is it captures CO2 in the bag, and now I'm going to cold crash the beer by setting it to 32 degrees. It's going to take a couple days to bring it down to 32 degrees. It's currently at 70. And as it cools and a vacuum is created, it's going to pull some of that CO2 back into the fermenter. I used to have an airlock on at this time, and I noticed it was sucking air back in. The 3-piece airlock, it would actually suck Star San back into the fermenter, which is not a good thing. So I switched over to this 2-liter medical grade bag, which again, if it doesn't fill up with CO2 from fermentation, I just use CO2 from my CO2 tank in the kegerator and fill it up, then attach it. This thing has been working really well. The only thing is that it has this white air valve, so you have to throw some tape over it because that is supposed to let air out as it fills up with liquid. In our case, we're just filling it with CO2. It's sterile. It's a perfect solution. It's just a few bucks. And so what we're going to do is in about 3 days, I'm going to go ahead and rack the beer into the keg. Okay, so 14 days have passed. Halfway through, I transferred the beer from the first fermenter into the second one and left the yeast behind. I also added 4 ounces of hops to the second fermenter, and fermentation kept going for those second half of 7 days. Now that it's been cold crashed for 2 days, I set the temperature to around 34 degrees to bring the temperature down so everything can settle. Then I move it inside the house, give it about an hour to settle down, hook up my CO2 lines at about 5 psi, and after I've already purged the keg of oxygen, I then connect the gas line into a Cobra tap here, and that kind of just adds CO2 to the top, so oxygen is never actually let into the fermenter throughout the entire process, and that forces the beer into the keg. So what I do is I keep adding CO2 to the fermenter until the top bows out like that, so I know there's sufficient pressure. And once it bows back in, or if I see bubbles come through the line, I turn it off and I can check the level by looking at the condensation on the side of the keg. Quick bonus video, this is one way I clean my beer lines in my kegerator. I first put some beer line cleaner in the lines and let it sit for 10 minutes, and then I flush it out by filling 1 bucket with clean water, hooking it up to a fountain pump, going up into the tap, and then it comes out the opposite direction and out the quick connect. And I have an adapter from brewhardware.com that allows that quick connect to open up and let the water come out. So I run a couple buckets through just to make sure all the beer line cleaner is out. It is very caustic, so it's best to just play it safe and make sure you flush the lines really well with clean water. After that, I then run sanitizer into it, Star San specifically, and let it sit in the lines until I'm ready to tap the next keg. Alright, and now for the grand finale. It's been 6 weeks since brew day. The beer sat in the first fermenter for 7 days. Then I racked the beer off the yeast to a second fermenter where it sat on some hops for another 7 days. And then after that was done, I racked it to the keg and set the keg into the kegerator. Hooked up the CO2 at 12 pounds per square inch. I put on a neoprene jacket on the bottom half, and there's a temperature probe inside of there to measure the temperature and make sure that it is kept at around 33 degrees. As it sits at 12 psi for about 2 weeks, it becomes carbonated, and then I let it set for another 2 weeks to condition, sometimes even longer. I've noticed that after about a month of conditioning, the beer definitely tastes better. You lose some of the grassy notes in the hops. So the total time from brew day to dispensing is at least 6 weeks, usually around 8 weeks. It just depends on the beer style. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and see how it came out. Now the first pour is usually pretty foamy because the beer that's in the lines is going to be warmer up here than below. But subsequent pours after that are not as foamy. Plus I'm also kind of using the wrong glass. I'm using IPA glass. It's normally not this foamy. I've already had it a couple times. It's got a nice citrus character to it, some pine. This recipe was very basic. It's a single malt, single hop. It only has 2-row barley and Cascade hops. It doesn't have any crystal malt or anything dark. It doesn't have any other hops in it. It's just really 4 ingredients, 1 type of barley, 1 type of hop, water, and yeast. That's it. So it's pretty straightforward. I'm doing beers like this just so I can learn what each hop profile brings to each beer. So the next one I'm going to do is going to be the exact same, except I'm going to change the hops out to Chinook or Columbus or Citra or Mosaic, just to get an idea of what each one tastes like. So that's pretty much it for how I brew beer in 2018 using electricity. If you have any questions, feel free to add it to the comments below. Otherwise, cheers.